Hello and welcome back to Farmers Inside Track, South Africa's most downloaded farmers podcast and winner of the 2024 One EFRA Award for the world's best news podcast. I'm your host, Duncan Masua. In our Agri-Trends deep dive, we turn the spotlight to high-value exports from fruit to nuts and how these sectors are navigating global trade shocks. My colleague Ivor Price spoke with ABSA agricultural economists Zama Sangweni and Kensani Mashimbi.
We never let a good crisis go to waste. So we saw that industry came together, the government came together. There was a FMD in Daba that allowed for stakeholders such as the RMIS to start, structuring traceability systems, conversations that brought the industry a step further. So it was a step in the right direction, which is why I always speak passionately about the efforts that the industry continues to make and how they continuously try and reshape the crises into opportunities.
Disease outbreaks and trade shocks has been the name of the game in South Africa's livestock sector in 2025, and this is evident from the much anticipated spring edition of ABSA's Agri-Trends report just released. Joining me, two of their leading agricultural economists who will help us make sense of what we're seeing in the livestock industry. And maybe, Kenzie, we kick off with you and some of the key factors influencing beef prices, particularly in 2025.
Sure. Thank you so much, Ivor. So we have been for a long time monitoring those beef price movements that continuously traded sideways for most of 2024. So our analysis was that there was a lot of pressure coming from the consumer side. The consumer was pressured because of their higher interest rates. You do understand we were in a tough consumer space, but when interest rates started coming down, we expected those prices to start picking up with the demand from the consumer ramping up. However, we didn't see that materializing towards the end of 2024, although the interest rates cycle had already commenced. And that was because of increased supply, and that was because on the back of drought as slaughter numbers went up. So the increase in demand was there. It was just met with increase in supply, so that those price movements didn't materialize at the beginning of the year. However, we started seeing that trend picking up. And I don't know if this is fortunate or unfortunate. Then after that, we saw the FMD outbreak. So biosecurity came and those prices just shot up. So the initial ramp up in that price or the initial price run was also because of panic buying. In those initial weeks, we saw prices now reaching highs of 83 Rand per kg for beef A prices, but they quickly normalized as demand destruction came in because it was a little bit more expensive than what the domestic consumer can afford. But what we also saw because of that disease outbreak is that there was a major feedlot producer that was impacted, that also impacted a lot of supply and how the industry was expecting, and the industry priced that in. But what was quite encouraging there is how they responded. I always go back to how nimble our sector is. I think you can see how much passion I have speaking about the industry. It's just amazing how they looked at alternative sourcing strategies. So they were efforts made to say, okay, we can't slaughter in-house animals because there are suspicions of the disease, but we can source outside and continue the slaughtering. So supply didn't dip to levels that we thought would dip, and that also didn't translate to falling winner prices. So they remained relatively firm throughout this crisis. And what we have noted in our continuous conversations is that supply is coming back, but it will take time. They have tested in those facilities, and they do note that in their major feedlot, there are no more noted cases of the disease outbreak, and supply is expected to normalize. It's expected to normalize toward the rest of the year. But what we need to note is that beef prices are probably not going to go back to the levels they were before the ramp up, because another dynamic that's shifting the prices is the higher demand from the consumer end. So yeah, that's what's been shaping the market. And I think maybe just to add before I conclude is that we never let a good crisis go to waste. So we saw that industry came together, the government came together. There was a FMD in Daba that allowed for stakeholders such as the RMIS to start, structuring traceability systems, conversations that brought the industry a step further. So it was a step in the right direction, which is why I always speak passionately about the efforts that the industry continues to make and how they continuously try and reshape the crises into opportunities.
I think you're absolutely right. Kudos to the red meat industry services for how they've been handling the livestock disease outbreaks. We have been seeing price surges in most of the livestock categories. We've also seen consumer purchasing power increase, but somehow pork prices remained relatively stable. How's that? Why is that?
So the pork market dynamics are also very interesting in that they went through a period of low margins, a tough period in 2022 and 2023 and 2024. And what happened there is that the profitability was squeezed because of higher feed prices. So what producers responded to, how they responded is to keep the animals for longer. So now we have, so when we quantify meat, it's the kgs. So now we have bigger animals being slaughtered. So it increased supply. The technology within the industry allowed for better efficiencies in production that kept supply higher and outpacing the higher consumer demand. However, towards the end of July, beginning of August, we saw those prices starting to pick up. So we see that it is taking more direction to what the broader industry is moving, how the broader industry is moving rather.
Zana, one thing that the average consumer doesn't always realize is that market dynamics, across the borders have an impact on what we see here in South Africa. And I'm wondering, what are some of the global trends that have been impacting lamb and mutton prices specifically in South Africa?
So with the sheep meat products, we'll definitely zoom into your big global players in terms of supply. That would be Australia and New Zealand. And if we pick up trends from those regions, we assess that during 2024, they also experienced an El Nino weather phenomenon where conditions were drier and warmer than usual. So what happened is that they liquidated some of their herds because it's quite difficult to keep a large herd in dry conditions. So they slaughtered a lot, and that ramped up supplies from those two regions, which in effect impacted global supplies because they are the two main players globally in terms of supply. So what we saw with prices then is that prices did come down because there's definitely a market oversupply. And then we also saw this effect being driven specifically by these two regions. But moving into 2025, we have had phases globally of moving more into a La Nina in some months earlier on in 2025 and a more neutral weather state. So we have seen some herd recoveries from specifically Australia. However, the recoveries are not as rapid as we would have expected them to be. Global demand is quite outpacing supplies from Australia specifically. And it's just something, it's a timing problem. We just need to wait a little bit longer to get those volumes up. But if we zoom into New Zealand, I think they're facing quite a bit of a different challenge. So in New Zealand, wool prices are a little bit low, taking away that incentive to continue with rebuilding your herd, maybe as large as it were pre-2024. There's also land conversions focusing on forestry, and then other producers that were farming with sheep are now moving into other profitable industries such as dairy. So land conversions is obviously going to reduce supply as well from that region. And I think the combined supply from both areas that we've seen at the beginning of 2025 and what we're going to expect towards the end of this season and in early 2026 is that global supplies have been coming down and are still going to come down. So the impact on global prices has been seen that global prices have been increasing for lamb and mutton. And I think from a local perspective as well, local sheep meat prices follow global trends. So we're kind of seeing South Africa follow that as well in terms of a pricing perspective. And again, I think South Africa has also done a great job in terms of lamb and mutton exports. We've grown compared to the numbers we were doing. If you're comparing it to 5 years ago, we've come a long way, because if you think about it, local domestic demand does not necessarily drive lamb and mutton consumption because it's so expensive. So we do more of an outward-looking focus, which is focused on global exports from a South African perspective.
It would be interesting to note in a year from now what impact our trade relations with the Middle East will have on the lamb and poultry market, because I see our government has been going all out to build relations there. If we could shift gears maybe to the poultry prices in South Africa, and you remember that absolute bloodbath in 2023, I think, with avian influenza. How have poultry prices in South Africa evolved since that major outbreak? And what are the current price drivers in the country when it comes to poultry?
Sure. So I like where you left the question. So 2023 was quite a challenging time for the industry with the avian influenza outbreak that led to major supply declines. I think the culling was up to 9.5 million birds that were culled in the
ridiculous.
Yeah, it was significant. Yeah, it was significant. So it impacted supply, which then supported prices. And again, we go back to how the industry responded. They responded quite encouragingly with a strategy such as sourcing eggs to make sure that supply corrects, or rather stabilizes, so that the prices can come back to normal. And as we started to see the industry rebuilding those chicken flocks and supply starting to stabilize, another issue came with a major producer within the country whose production was halted because of operational challenges. So that supply was taken away from the value chain. And as we see the other players trying to fill those gaps, it started to drive prices also at the beginning of the year. And as the prices were gaining that momentum, we saw our major import destination, Brazil, where we import a lot of our it's a source for most of our import for poultry. We do import about 20% of our consumption locally. They were struck, or they experienced their very first ever avian influenza outbreak in May. So that also curtailed, or rather halted those supplies for some time. And I think the strategy that was adopted there was more of a blanket approach to ban those exports from Brazil. However, it was not going to be realistic for what we need on a month-to-month basis, especially considering what we import from Brazil. It's mechanically deboned meat that is mostly used for processed meats such as the polonies, the Viennas, that really impact the lower income consumer. So it is important for our consumption or ongoing consumption. So they regionalize rather the way the import was banned. It was necessary, but the strategy was rather to regionalize it. And then as we moved down the line, we saw that they contained it rather quickly. It was impressive. And now imports have started flowing again. But the dynamic meat complex also plays an important point now, as we mentioned earlier, that with the higher beef prices, we see meat prices, the whole livestock basket being pulled to higher levels, but also the consideration that the operational challenges with the major player haven't been sorted. They are still in the process of sorting that, so supply is still low. So we do expect those prices to stabilize at higher levels for the remainder of the year, and then dynamics will be monitored as we go on. And perhaps to just take a step back and to point at the significance of biosecurity, we did see, I think, two outbreaks of avian influenza in Northwest and in Mpumalanga, but they were also quickly resolved locally in South Africa. So it remains a very important aspect to monitor. But also what's encouraging, there's been talks of vaccination. I think there is a major operation that has also vaccinated a portion of their birds. So we see movement in that front as well. So that's what we continue to monitor, and that's what will continue shaping prices going forward.
And also all sorts of interesting developments coming from Onderstepoort when it comes to vaccine. It's clear that the South African agricultural sector at large is very resilient, but how about consumers? Zama, how are they responding to rising meat prices across, I think, all livestock categories?
Interesting point, Ivo, and very important factor to have a conversation about. So July figures for headline CPI came out in August. And what we've seen is that food inflation was a significant contributor. If we zoom into which commodities within food CPI, we do pick up that meat did play a significant role. And how I like to think about it is a food chain perspective when it comes to livestock. So your sheep is at the top of the food chain, then beef, and then you have your lower players in terms of preferences or sensitivity in terms of prices. You have pork and poultry. So lamb is a bit of an outlier because it is more of a luxury meat product. And like I've already explained, South Africa is more inclined for sheep meat exports. That's a market we play in better. But it's quite expensive to purchase lamb and mutton in South Africa. But if we consider, like Kenzie has touched on, beef prices, it's quite sensitive. Consumers are quite sensitive to beef price changes. So as we've seen with the FMD outbreak, beef prices have gone up, and consumers responded by contracting their demand, right? You're more inclined to buy something that's more affordable than it is at a higher price. So we've seen that pullback, and what that does is it influences the demand trends for your other livestock categories, for instance, your poultry and your pork. So consumers are quite sensitive to livestock changes. And if one of the industries experiences a problem like FMD did in this season, you kind of see a ripple effect throughout the rest of the livestock basket. So consumers are quite sensitive. And I think it's quite an interesting point to touch on and engage discussions with individuals, because imagine your non-affluent and low-income earning households. Meat is a source of animal protein. It's quite important in a person's diet. So if price trends are driving demand away from specific categories, does it not leave specific households vulnerable? And I think these are conversations that we stay on top of in order to understand which groups and how exactly the consumer is affected.
Yeah, and I like what you touched on. When we attended the BFAB baseline launch now in, I think a week later. Yeah. What I found interesting was how they broke down the carcass for beef, and how the industry thinks in their strategy of how we maximize the carcass value. So there are specific cuts that get higher return for export markets such as China. And perhaps I should have mentioned earlier that in times where there's FMD outbreaks, we usually lose those export markets, but they are very important for also the return for the producer as well to maximize, because those cuts are usually more expensive, but there are other cuts within the broader carcass that are destined for South Africa as well. So it is encouraging to see how the industry is also thinking about maximizing on the export value while also catering for the local industry. But it remains very important for those export markets and those strategies for the return in some of this export orientated industries such as beef and lamb. Yeah.
So at the risk of oversimplifying it, as a consumer standing in front of a shelf, beef prices are rising, people are now buying more chicken and I think pork products. That's what they're saying, right?
So Ivo, I think Based on consumer preferences, we do note that pork is preferred by a specific group. It's influenced by religious or traditional beliefs. So more consumers will lean more towards your poultry products. But then your other groups that are not as sensitive to pork, it depends where pork prices or poultry prices, are sitting. With the avian influenza outbreak, if those prices are also higher, as an instance where there's also an issue within beef, the beef industry and prices, then they lean more towards one specific industry. But the simple answer to the question is that they are sensitive. They do change their choices in terms of meat categories based on prices.
Yeah. And maybe to add there, and maybe I always take the industry's perspective, but it's how the industry has been responding, and we also learned this during the BFAB launch now, that through the poultry master plan, efforts have been made to ramp up, or to rather increase production for I think it's bone-ins have increased. So when local production, we are able to protect that, and we are able to produce locally, it I think bodes well for local consumers as well. If we are able to supply locally and increase production, I think it bodes well for the industry as well. So we see that production for some of the industries is ramping up, and sometimes even outpacing the demand. So it bodes well for local production and ultimately the consumer.
And the one thing we know for sure is that South Africans will braai.
Yes.
It doesn't matter what, we won't easily give up our braai.
Yeah.
Thank you for helping us make sense of what we're seeing, some of the changes and the dynamics in the livestock sector. The ABSA Agri Trends Report, the latest edition, the spring edition, now available for download in most platforms, and be on the lookout for our next discussion, which will be on some of the high value commodities in South Africa's agricultural sector.
That brings us to the end of our conversation on high value exports in the 2025 ABSA Agri Trends Spring Report. A special thanks to agricultural economists Zama Sangweni and Kensani Mashimbi for their insights. For extended analysis, visit Freedom Mzansi's website. I'm Duncan Masiwa, and you've been listening to Farmers Inside Track.